India, this war is really, really bad. High oil prices will trash their economy, and they have a very young population. And if their economy craters, and it was already very fragile because of COVID, then you have a lot of unemployed youth, which makes them very ripe for radicalization of all sorts. It's also very bad for the Quad. And that's why when you had this Quad meeting and President Biden was reportedly trying to encourage a statement about Ukraine, India was saying, Quad is about the Indo-Pacific and it's about China. If you bring Ukraine into this, this may not be the grouping for us. They want to keep the focus very much on China.
So this sounds like there's a lot of complicated geopolitical factors going on. Like India obviously would not like Russia's invasion because that might encourage China to do some kind of invasion. However, it also seems like India wants to keep in the good graces of Russia to protect them from a possible Chinese invasion. And at the same time, China must be happy that this is driving a wedge between India and the other members of the Quad that then benefits China. So there's so many conflicting, what's the word? It's
complicated.
It's complicated.
Yeah, I like everything in, black and white, clear terms, ones and zeros. It's just, you're making this really hard for me.
Yeah, this is and there's a lot of if X go to line 6, where you just kind of repeat and repeat and repeat. It's like, okay, if we do this, then you end up in this dead end, or you end up in this dead end. And it's not. And in the case of India, they're not just concerned about Chinese encroachment on their territory, but also Pakistan encroachment on their territory. Mm-hmm. So which brings in this whole kind of Sino-Wahhabi element, which gets brought up in Indian strategic communities as well. So yes, it is incredibly complex. Throughout it all, the people of Ukraine are suffering tremendously. And in the case of India, they're concerned about that expanding, cascading, and compounding in ways that will create very serious insecurity across the Indo-Pacific. And Chris, you brought up this issue about China being happy about potentially a wedge between India and the Quad. And you're starting to see different signaling about India in the Chinese media. So, a piece appeared recently saying that maybe it was a mistake to have the Chinese military hero of Galwan be a torchbearer during the Olympic ceremony. Maybe we should, try to keep India at least neutral. So that old kind of thing of Nixon wanting to use China against the Soviet Union, now you're seeing it with at least 4 or 5 different moving parts trying to do that. You have the West, which may or may not be a monolithic bloc. You have the Middle East, you have India, you have China, you have Russia. You also have parts of Africa. So everybody's trying to figure out. There's the so far contained military component of it, the kinetic warfare, but there's this whole larger kind of global political warfare. It's World War II in a political warfare sense. And a lot of the elements in there are trying to ensure that it doesn't become, global in a kinetic sense from their own perspective. And there's an enormous amount of anger at the West for mismanagement. Not only first COVID, global financial crisis, and now this. I'm sorry these are long answers, but there, like you said, Shelley, a lot of moving parts here. Or no, Chris said, yeah, sorry, whoever.
So my question is, what is Russia's interest in India? Because obviously, like what they did with the students, they see some kind of advantage to keeping India on their side.
Yeah, so there are multiple reasons. India is a country of over 1 billion people. It's a massive market. It allows Russia to hedge to a certain degree against China. And if we're talking about the development of a parallel economic system, then you want India to be part of it. So India has now talked about, and I think it probably will, buy heavily discounted Russian oil, probably in a rupee ruble swap. So there's this, it's part of this major abandonment of the dollar, of the Western economic system. And India is saying, you want to sanction us? Go right ahead. We know how much you need us, especially in the Indo-Pacific.
I mean, that's really interesting because we've known for a long time that, China and Russia are trying to create a financial system that is impervious to Western sanctions, particularly U.S. sanctions, but they rely on the U.S. dollars.
Right.
However,
something like 90% of international trade is the money's converted to U.S. dollars before being switched then into that third currency.
But if they are able to get India, a population of 1 billion people, on board with whatever alternate system they have, then that's pretty significant.
It is, but I don't know that you can get India and China on the same system.
What if they all just use the Chinese digital yuan?
Well, that's the problem. Will India want to take yuan?
Maybe for some kind of guarantee on the border from China, backed up by Russia.
They wouldn't trust them. I mean,
not.
They've lived in the same neighborhood for long enough to know that they wouldn't trust him on that. But it does. But from a U.S. perspective, they don't even have to have one competing system. It can just be all of these dollars, all of these trades pulled out of the U.S. system, and it could be rupee ruble, for example, which is I think actually what they were proposing doing for the S-400 system ultimately, because then it may not. The idea was it wouldn't trigger the CAATSA sanctions because it wasn't a trade being done in U.S. dollars. And there's this whole thing about what are these sanctions for? Are they deterrent? And I've heard the Indians said, well, if you're sanctioning for the sake of deterrence, it didn't work at all. And I don't, and if you continue to do the deterrence in that way, more of us may start to get very concerned about having our money in your systems. And this is apparently an element of the sanctions bill that's before Biden, is that they can just unilaterally decide anybody at any time should be sanctioned. And this is in a macro way, sort of what happened in a minor way with the trucker protest in Canada, where they started freezing bank accounts at a very low level. So somebody contributed $50 or $100 to the convoy when it was legal, and then suddenly found their bank accounts frozen. And there was that overt statement by somebody in the government, I think it was the Attorney General's, when they were asked about it, saying, well, if you're a Trump supporter and you donate 100,000 or million or whatever, you should be worried. So that was a direct linkage to a kind of political position and this economic canceling, so to speak. It's a social credit type system, right, where you control behavior. And because in the case of the truckers, it was not clear whether it was legal or not legal. In fact, we had one of the last surviving premier, who was a signatory to the charter, was in the process of suing the government, saying the mandates were illegal. And I mean, he wrote the charter. This would be like one of the founding fathers sort of saying, yeah, what you're doing, that's not what we wanted in the law. And he went and spoke in front of the protesters. And under the Emergency Act, it's unclear whether that would be a justification for him to have his bank accounts frozen.
So the guy who made the sanctions would be sanctioned.
Yeah. Well,
not sanctioned.
Well, bank account frozen.
Yeah.
And this is very much the Chinese system, which within China, it's a gray zone. You don't know when you cross the line. So the goal is to keep you very far back from the line. That's the case. You self-censor out of fear of not knowing where the line is.
And so India's concern is that, the Biden administration has criticized India for a variety of issues. There's human rights issues. The concern is that they might find themselves on the wrong end of some kind of U.S. sanctions as well.
Yeah, and also individuals. I mean, and this goes back to the political warfare thing. Putin made a speech where he talked about people, Russians who had their, fancy houses in Miami or whatever. And it's basically saying, if you have your property there and it gets seized, don't blame us. It's because you weren't, loyal enough. But the implicit threat is, if you have any of your assets in those locations, they're vulnerable to seizure. So, and again, I'm not. This isn't a right or wrong, or whether sanctions should continue to be applied or whatever. I'm describing how this is being received and perceived within some sectors of the Indian strategic community, and how that's affecting decision making. And the effect is, maybe we shouldn't be investing in the U.S. because we'll get sanctioned. And so that those are not secure assets. And that's at an individual level, and that's at a macro level. And we know from the case of from the truckers' protests, there's very strong anecdotal evidence that some serious American investors and global investors are thinking more than once about whether or not to invest in Canada. And that may have been one of the reasons why the Emergency Act was pulled out, because money was, the banks were saying they're going to close accounts and they're going to take the money and they're going to leave. So, this reaction, this canceling at a macro level geopolitically, is being perceived in a very different way with different audiences. As is this conflation between the population and the leadership. So, Facebook saying it's okay to, talk about violence against Russians if it's in the context of Ukraine, but at least opening that door because Putin's a bad guy, also makes people very nervous, because we've been very clear, all of us have been very clear for a long time. For example, in the case of China, the Chinese Communist Party is not the Chinese people, right? And the Chinese people are the biggest victims of the Chinese Communist Party. But now the dominant narrative is collective guilt for Russians. So this is being perceived in a lot of places, not just India, but definitely in India, as a very, very dangerous time for countries that are trying to figure out where they can fit within this U.S.-led paradigm for international relations, and their geopolitical reality, which may be a little bit more complex.